personal epistles. Some have said the most personal epistle that Paul wrote. And some of the older scholars have even said that it reads a little bit like a personal diary in places. And so it gives a unique insight into Paul's heart, into his motivations, into his love and his care and compassion for others. And I think that he serves as a great example in those things to us. A lot of times when older preachers are counseling younger preachers, they'll say, you know, you need to every month read through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Well, another that would be excellent would be 2 Corinthians, because it really is a very personal, in some places even heart-rending or heart-breaking epistle. As he begins in chapter 1 and verse 1, he identifies himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. And Timothy is with him. Now he had in 1 Corinthians chapter, the last chapter of 1 Corinthians, he talked about how he was going to send Timothy, or he intended to send Timothy. Chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians verse 10, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear, for he does the work of the Lord as I also do. Therefore let no one despise him, but send him on his journey in peace, that he may come to me, for I'm waiting for him with the brethren. So it may be that the news that Paul got that prompted him to go make this painful visit came from Timothy. Timothy is with him when he is writing this letter. Paul identifies himself as an apostle by the will of God. Now, he doesn't identify himself as a bondservant, which he often does in his epistles. And I don't know that that's neither here nor there. The emphasis in this epistle is on the authority and authenticity of the apostleship of Paul, because that's one of the things that was being questioned. So he makes the point here that he is an apostle of Jesus Christ. But did he choose this for himself? No. He says, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. If you go back to Acts chapter 8, verses 15 and 16, you'll see that when the Lord called Ananias to go to, he was then called Saul of Tarsus, he was very reluctant, and God told Ananias to tell him, I have chosen him. I've chosen him for a specific purpose. I'm going to show him the things that he's going to have to suffer for my name's sake. Paul repeats this, very similar language in Acts chapter 22, verses 12 to 16, a little more elaborate in that instance. But perhaps the most expansive explanation that the Apostle Paul gives to this is in the very next epistle, in Galatians chapter 1. Let's turn over there just a few pages. Galatians chapter 1, verse 1, it says, Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Look at verses 11 and 12. I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. He didn't come up with it by himself. I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so everything Paul does, everything he preaches, comes directly from the revelation he received from Jesus Christ. And then on down in chapter 1 of Galatians again, beginning in verse 15, when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. So now he goes not just back to his conversion, but all the way back to his birth. That God chose him, that God selected him and had a purpose for his life when Paul was born, before Paul was born. He called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. That is, I didn't go to other people. When the Lord spoke to me, I didn't go to other people and say, hey, what do you think about this? He took it at face value. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So he didn't take it to the committee, so to speak. He took what the Lord said at face value and he acted upon it. So he is an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. It's addressed to the church of God, which is at Corinth. He uses a very common salutation in verse 2, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now this comes into play a little later as he talks about comfort and that these things come from God. So begin then in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. Let's stop there. Now, he says he identifies God as the God of all comfort. Well, why is he right off the bat talking about comfort here? Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. It says in verse 9, for a great and effective door has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. There are many adversaries. So he has a great opportunity. Have you ever heard that saying, people miss opportunities because they come dressed in work clothes? Well, this opportunity came dressed in persecution clothes and their tormentors' clothes. And it seems to me that Paul has been enduring some of these adversaries or whatever they were dishing out. You look a little later, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. Well, verses 8 and 9. We do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia. We were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves. That is, they thought they were going to die. That we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. That is terrible suffering that they're enduring. And so he ends 1 Corinthians by saying, hey, there's a great door of opportunity open. But it comes with a lot of suffering attached to it. And they've been enduring that suffering. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but he says, beyond measure, above strength, we thought we were going to die. And so, one thing that Paul understands keenly, therefore, is the comfort that God gives. Now, he says he is the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, verse 3, who comforts us in all our tribulation. How much tribulation must we endure, or what kinds of tribulation must we endure that God does not comfort us in? There is none. There's nothing that we can suffer in this life through which God cannot give us comfort. He comforts us in all our tribulation. It's very important that we remember that God is able to empathize with our suffering. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. Can someone read that, please? Hebrews chapter 2, verses 16 to 18.
For indeed he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in all things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted.
For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to help those who are tempted. The King James Version uses the word succor, and it S-U-C-C-O-R, and it's the tenderness and that comfort that a mother has as she holds a nursing child to her breast. You may have heard or seen situations where a child is fussy, a child is upset, and she will either hold the baby close or she'll begin nursing the child, and that relieves the child of their distress. It gives it comfort. It's that kind of closeness. It's that kind of comfort that God gives, and it comes, He's able to do that because He has suffered being tempted. Go over about a page in Hebrews to chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Same principle here he's talking about. He's talking about the high priesthood of Jesus. Can someone read, please, verses 15 and 16 in Hebrews chapter 4?
We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.
Notice this all-inclusive all again. He was in all points tempted like as we are. You can take that and you can draw an arrow right back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 4, who comforts us in all our tribulation. Why is God able to comfort us in all our tribulation? Because He suffered in all points like we suffer. So many times, I'm trying to emphasize this strongly, because so many times today Christians feel they just feel helpless sometimes because they don't know where to go for comfort. They don't know where to go for help. But God gives comfort in all things, in all situations, in all temptations. He is able to comfort us. He is able to aid us and help us. So we don't need to feel like we're at our wits' end. God is able to help us. But notice what Paul says there in verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 4. Can you read that again, please?
Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.
Okay. The help is there, right? But what do we need to do? Approach. Let us therefore come boldly. The help's there. Come to the help And you're able to come boldly because he's a sympathetic high priest. He's sympathetic. So it's his point in chapter 2 of Hebrews, verses 16 and 17. He's a sympathetic high priest. Well, why is it that people don't approach? Why is it that they go everywhere else but the throne of God? Faith. A lack of faith. And that is it. Pure, plain, and simple. The comfort that we are able to receive from God in difficulties is directly proportional to the amount and the strength of our faith. What do they call that? A positive coefficient. As one increases, the other increases. As we increase our faith, what will also increase? The comfort that we can receive in God. And so if we want to be able to receive the comfort that God offers, what do we need to do? We need to increase our faith. Strengthen our faith through the Word. He's going to address this, come back to it several times. Make mention of that. So, as far as a preliminary goes, we need to understand these two things. God is able to comfort us in how many tribulations and troubles? All of them. But the comfort we receive is directly proportional to what? Our faith. And so, like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, there's no temptation taken you but such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will now not allow you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with temptation make a way of escape. All kind of temptations. Some of those temptations are tribulations and persecutions. And the only escape from that is the comfort that God gives. All right, there's a third point here, and the third point we need, well, two more points we need to make here in verses 4 and 5. One of the reasons Paul says we're comforted is so that we may be able to do what? Comfort others. Notice what he says here. Speaking of God, verse 4, the who here is the God of all comfort from verse 3. So God of all comfort comforts us in all our tribulations, that, or we might say in order that, or so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. So the comfort we received is not to be hoarded, is it? It's to be shared. Why? Because not everybody has the same amount of faith, right? Our comfort is proportional to our faith, but not everyone has the same amount of faith. So if the comfort that I need is way up here, but maybe I'm a babe in Christ and my faith is way down here, what's going to make up that difference?
The brother comforts that.
You. You're going to make up that difference. Because here again, something has to balance that out. Something has to get me from here up to here. I need, if my need for comfort's here, I need something that's going to bring that up. And right now, my faith is here. So it's on you then, my brethren in Christ, to come help me with that and bring it up. This is why Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, bear ye one another's burdens. He says, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness, lest ye also be tempted. Notice he singles them out and says, you who are spiritual. Someone who has a discernment to see, hey, you know, Judy is really suffering and her comfort need is up here, but you know, I've been talking to her and she doesn't have the comfort up here. She's kind of down here. So I need to go help her, take someone with me maybe, and help her get her up to here. That's spiritual thinking. That's looking beneath the surface. In so doing, what am I fulfilling? Bear ye one another's burdens. Paul talked here in verse 8 of 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He says, we were burdened beyond measure. The burden there is like a burden that an animal carries. Sometimes I remember that first backpacking trip that my oldest boy and I took. Man, by about the fourth day, that backpack felt like it was just, oh. It just pushes you. That's what, when he says burden beyond measure, it's just like someone pushing down on you. It's heavy already, and someone comes along and just pushes down on it. More than I can bear. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. What's the law of Christ? John 13, 34 and 35. The new commandment? Love one another as I've loved you. And so in giving comfort, we are fulfilling the law of Christ. Well, it's not enough. It's not enough. Well, look at verse 5 here. As the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. And so here again, it's tied to faith. As the suffering ramps up and it ramps up and it ramps up and it ramps up, so also his comfort ramps up and it ramps up to where they're equal. But here again, what's it tied to? Hebrews 4 and verse 16. Therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace. It's there, but if we're not willing to take it, if we're not willing to take advantage of it, you know. Some of you probably had surgeries where, you know, when you woke up from the surgery, they put this little button in your hand. You know what that's for? What's that for? Yeah. It doesn't work like that, does it? It's right there, but what good does it do me if I don't push the button? Sitting here whining and complaining, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Well, push the button. The comfort is there. We need to push the button. And we don't need to be bashful about it. The Hebrew writer says, come boldly unto the throne of grace. The come boldly is not, well, Lord, if you think you can manage it. No, to come boldly is come up and say, help! That's what it means to come boldly. Questions on verses 3 to 5, comments or observations? Yes.
You mentioned how we help other people. And other people help us, we don't always recognize it at the time. In the latest class that was studying about, they have studied recently about Ruth and Naomi. Ruth helped Naomi that way.
Yeah, that's my aunt cross-stitched that passage. Is it from chapter 1? Entreat me not to leave thee, nor to return from following after thee. And she cross-stitched that passage for Heather and I. Just imagine how comforting that must have been for Naomi. When she gets back, what does she call herself? Mara. And that means bitterness. Well, imagine what that would have been like without Ruth. And she was a Gentile. So, good point.
Well, I think we should look for opportunities too, to see somebody in need that you know is having trouble, and not let it go. Sometimes they don't want to approach, don't want to admit. It's also our responsibility to pick up on that. Does that make sense up there?
I think that gets back to what he said in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, you who are spiritual. To be spiritual is to be concerned about spiritual things, to be spiritually minded. So this is what you're talking about, that discernment where you pick up on things. Why? Because you're not so much concerned about the latest sports scores or things political or things, with the bank account and the, stuff with your car problems or whatever, all these things that just pepper us in our life can overwhelm us. And I heard one motivational speaker say one time, he says, you have to get past, you have to be able to filter out the urgencies so that you can focus on what's important. Because a lot of times the things that are urgent are not the things that are important. A telephone ringing or that ding that I just got a text or something like this, that's urgent. It's just crying out for attention. But if I'm sitting having dinner with my wife and we're talking about something that's, important, I'm sitting here, hold on a minute. That's not important. So to be spiritually minded is to have that discernment that you're talking about and to be able to be there's a fine line between being persistent and being a pest. And here discernment comes in again. You don't want to be a pest, but sometimes you may need to be persistent. Because what's our standard response when someone says, how you doing? Oh yeah, fine, doing good. And sometimes we're not. So we need to be able to pick up sometimes on those nonverbal clues. Women are real good at that, men not so much. We need to sometimes fine-tune our antennas a little bit. Good point. Anything else in verses 3 to 5? So there's 3 main points here, well 4, that I think we need to take away from these 3 verses. That is, God is the source of all comfort. So there's no comfort that we need that God will not supply. He comforts us so that we may be able to comfort others. And then that comfort is proportional to our faith. We have to take advantage of it. And then as the tribulations increase, so the consolation increases. Verse 5. Now, no, I don't want to go there right now. Let's go on to verse 6. Now, if we are afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation. So he's talking about two things. He's talking about affliction and consolation or comfort. If we're afflicted, it's for your consolation and salvation, which is effected for enduring the same sufferings, which we also suffer. Or if we are comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. What does he mean by all this? He says, whatever we are enduring, whether we're being comforted or whether we're being afflicted, it is for you, for your consolation and for your salvation. How does that work? Well, can someone read, please, Romans chapter 15 and verse 4?
For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope.
The things written aforetime that Paul's talking about here are what? Old Testament. He says the things written before are written for our learning. Written for our learning. So we need to learn the Old Testament because there's a benefit in learning the Old Testament. So that we, through the patience, the word patience comes from a word that means endurance, a Greek word hupomone, and it means to bear up under. To bear up under, and it's endurance. It's not patience like, okay, no. It's endurance. So that we, through the patience and what? Comfort of the Scriptures, or from the Scriptures, we might have hope. What are some of the things we learn from the Old Testament concerning endurance and comfort? Did the people that we look to as, probably not the best terminology, but heroes of faith, like Ruth and Naomi, particularly Ruth and Boaz, like Abraham, Moses, some of the judges, David, the prophets, did they endure things, difficulties? They sure did. Did they receive comfort from God? Yes, they did. Did they make it? Did they make it through their journey? Yes. Those who held their faith, who were strong in the faith. Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, says we are surrounded. And I think this is Hebrews chapter 12. Yeah. So you've got Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about all these great stalwarts of faith in the Old Testament. And going back to Abel, son of Adam, And so then he says in chapter 12, the very first verse, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. That is, all these stalwarts of the faith, they surround us. Therefore, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which easily snares us, and run with endurance the race that is set before us. This is the patience and comfort of the Scriptures. When we look to the examples from the Old Testament of the things that they suffered, the things that they endured. Verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And so, how is it that we're comforted? We're comforted by, he says here, if we are comforted, it's for your consolation and salvation. Paul's saying we are an example. Whether we are suffering, here in verse 6, if we're afflicted, it's for your consolation and salvation. Why? How did Paul endure suffering and affliction? What about when he and Silas were in Philippi, in the prison? How were they enduring that suffering? They were singing. Is that an example for us? Yes, it is. So if we're afflicted, it's for your consolation and salvation. Why? Because you can see in us the attitude that one should have in affliction. If we're comforted, it's for your consolation and salvation. So that you see that there's comfort, there's affliction, but the comfort God provides can rise to the affliction. And our hope for you, this is verse 7 now, back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Our hope for you is steadfast. You know, we'll see when we get to chapter 2, when he talks about that painful visit. You know, if this had been me, I'd have been gritting my teeth writing this. I mean, when we go back, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he talks about Apollos in verse 12 and said, Paul strongly urged him to come. Apollos said no. Now, maybe a couple of reasons for that. Maybe it was because Apollos realized, I think we talked about this last week, Apollos realized they're dividing up. You know, they might think I'm there to recruit people to my side. Now, I'm not going to be part of that. Apollos might have just been sick of them. I'm sick of dealing with those folks. He might not have been as patient as Paul was. So whatever the case, he said, I'm not going. But look what Paul says. Our hope for you is steadfast. He still loves these brethren in spite of how they have treated him and just abused him and let others abuse him. He still is loving and patient with them. Our hope for you is steadfast because we know that as you are partakers of the suffering, so also you will partake of the consolation. You're suffering, but guess what? You're going to have the consolation. You're going to have the comfort that God offers as well. So in verses 8 to 11 then, he talks about, you know, some of the suffering that they have endured. He really doesn't go into specifics. He just describes the pain. He describes the level of suffering. He says, we don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble, which came to us in Asia. We were burdened beyond measure. You know, a lot of people, they have a good idea of what they can carry. They have experience carrying in groceries and things, so they have a good idea of what they can carry, what they can endure. And so when they come up to a situation or they come up to something, say something needs to be carried, think, no, we're going to need help with that. Or you grab a hold of it, it doesn't move. Got to get some help with that. Or we know a level of pain that we can endure. And so you go to the doctor and say, I need to draw blood. You know, okay, no problem. Had that done before. And someone comes in and says, I need to amputate your finger without anesthesia. No, I'm not doing that, sorry. We know, well, Paul says we were burdened beyond measure. In other words, it wasn't something that they looked at ahead of time and thought, hey, yeah, we can. They looked at that and said, oh, man, how? It was just beyond measure. He says we were above strength. So more than their strength could bear. Come back to this in a minute in the next verse. You ever said that? That is more than I can bear. That's more than I can bear. So that we despaired even for life. We're not going to make it through this. Is that a sentence of life in ourselves? That is, we thought we were going to die. Well, I guess that's the first bell at the time for the second bell. That is the first bell, right? Yeah, they're opening the door, so I guess I'm done. All right, we'll pick up at verse 8 next week. Thanks for being here this morning.